Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is John Rapley, who is an author, a columnist, an economist, a commentator in Johannesburg and Canada. He's in the Globe and Mail almost every Saturday. He's a deep thinker, and I wanted to connect up with him because, John, you've written numerous different articles over the course of the last several weeks and months, particularly that I've read in the Globe and Mail, but also on LinkedIn and elsewhere where you post them about Canada, and you're pretty negative about Canada and its current prospects. And I wanted to, check in with you about, why you've come to that assessment and how we got to where we are.
I think, Brian, we've just become complacent because we've had a rather easy ride for the last century. I mean, Canada had a very, it was, as Wilfrid Laurier famously said at the beginning of the 20th century, it would be Canada's century. In many ways it was. It just benefited from a constellation of events and factors that just meant that it was a country very charmed, if you will, by nature, by geopolitics, by fate, to have a very prosperous century based essentially on the fact that it had a very large per capita endowment of natural resources at a time of rapid industrialization in the world economy. And that continued well into this century, which meant that we effectively, as I used to always tell my students in development studies, Canada is best understood as a rich third world country in terms of its structure.
What? Hold it. A rich third world country?
Right. Yeah. That it's essentially, in terms of the structure of production, in terms of its, research and development, in terms of product innovation, it's not at it's nowhere near the technological frontier. It could be, but it isn't. And it hasn't had to be because it's been able to basically live very comfortably off natural resource exports, commodity exports. And that model, after several generations, bred a certain complacency in Canadians. They sort of thought, well, we're rich because we've done well, we've educated, we've built a good political system, we have a good education system, some of which was true, but also much of which was exaggerated. And in fact, it really was largely just, good fortune. And good, no question about good political management. You can be a resource-rich country and not be prosperous. There are lots of countries in, for example, Africa that are in that situation. But what Canada was never doing was anticipating the way, there was, and I think there still is an expectation this will continue forever. When I listen to critics, for example, of current government policy, who say it's too ambitious, it goes too far, I would say, if anything, the problem with the policy in Canada is not ambitious enough.
Policy in Canada is not ambitious enough.
Right. That the kind of the criticism of the Canadian government for saying it taxes too much, when in fact there's very little international comparison made. When people say the taxes are too high in Canada, that's the problem. They're comparing apples and oranges. They're comparing it to the United States, which doesn't have a public healthcare system, which doesn't have a public tertiary education system quite like Canada's. So it's an entirely different, you really have to compare it with peer countries which are trying to provide the same level of public services, and that's Europe. And by those standards, Canada is undertaxed. And that means is that the resources available for the kind of infrastructure development, industrial policy are not available. And the result is we have the kind of things, one of the reasons it's so expensive to build housing in Canada is because all the charges are put onto the developers rather than absorbed into the public purse. And secondly, because of a model of urbanization, which is constantly building further and further outwards, which is very expensive. And that means that development charges and new properties end up being very high. So which is not only a net resource drain in the economy, it is actually leading to what I've written before for the Globe Mail is very unproductive cities. It's one of the reasons Canada's labor productivity is so poor, because of the way we have mapped out our cities.
Unproductive cities.
Yeah. I mean, it's first of all, I would say in terms of resource allocation, it's very inefficient. I mean, let me give you an example, Brian. When I was at one time in my life, I was working at a university in the south of France. If I needed to get to a meeting in Paris, if somebody said, "Can you come to a meeting in Paris tomorrow or give a seminar in Paris, tomorrow?" I could book a ticket, go up in the morning, and then come back in the evening train after having had dinner with them. And when I point out to people, I sort of here, I remember saying to somebody, if I'm in Montreal and I'm invited to a similar kind of seminar in New York or a similar kind of meeting, the only option is to fly and book a hotel room, which becomes hugely expensive. So it's not generally something you do. And I said, I should be able to take a train. They said, oh, well, yeah, but the distances are so much greater, but they're not. In fact, the distance between Montreal and New York is less than the distance from Marseille to Paris. We think the distances are great because of the way we have laid out our infrastructure. We have we're the only developed country without any kind of high-speed rail network. And the time it takes to get to Toronto, which should be at most a 2-hour train ride with trains going every 20 minutes, which would mean it's not just that I could get to a meeting, but if I was going from Montreal to Toronto, but it also means that people could go for job interviews. It means that the pool of labor available to employers, for example, is much bigger, which means you tend to get far more efficient resource allocation. The same goes for cities which are compact and with very good public transit systems, is people are connected to the jobs at which they're going to be the most productive. As it is, the only way you can get to a job like that is if you have a car. And the time spent in traffic in North America, it eats into output. And these kinds of things that just simply don't come up much in conversation. I mean, you do get people writing about it, but when I listen to the policy debates, it all goes back to, well, we like our cars, so let's just keep building more and more roads out. That's the kind of lack of 21st century thinking. That was a model that worked relatively well at a certain time under certain conditions, but those conditions have changed, and in the world it's going to become even less favorable to resource exporters like Canada.
So you think we need to build more compact, more dense cities with better transit?
We need intensification of cities. I think we need better public transit. I think we need high-speed rail. I think we need high-speed internet, and these should be all, I think when I talk about ambitious government, this should be things that are driven by the government. That's expensive, and that requires tax money. But my argument is that the taxes well spent lead to production output that ultimately, done properly, pays itself in taxes.
Let me ask you a question about the rail, because you talked about inner city rail. The Neptus Foundation did a study at one point in time in the Toronto area and said that the second largest central economic zone in all of Canada was the airport corporate zone. So Pearson Airport along the 401 to what's commonly referred to as Pill Hill. Bigger than Montreal, bigger than Vancouver. So the number one corporate zone, employment zone, is downtown Toronto, but the second largest employment zone is the airport corporate zone. And they said, good cities that have two employment zones have to be connected by rapid transit for a lot of the things you mentioned, that people got to be able to go for a job interview, they got to be able to go for a meeting, they got to be able to go for a board of trade event, or, doing the things that an ecosystem needs to be successful. And they use the example of the Champs-Élysées and La Défense, London, City of London and Canary Wharf, Brooklyn and New Jersey to Manhattan. And there's no transit that connects the airport corporate zone and downtown Toronto. And, I used to work in the airport corporate zone. If someone invited you to a lunch speech, you had to leave at like 10:45 to get there in time for a 12 o'clock start, and so you didn't do it. Or if you did do it, it was like going to New York or Montreal. You planned a full day because it took so long to get there and park and get to your meeting that you had to dedicate a half or 3/4 of a full day to make it justified.
Yeah.
Is that argument a reasonable argument at all?
I think it's very reasonable, Brian. Let me give you an illustration. I mean, I'm, from the field I know best, which is, in academia. When I was working in England, of course, I worked at 2 universities. I started my career in Oxford, finished in Cambridge, and then in between lived in London. Now, I could, for example, attend, if somebody was giving, an esteemed lecturer was giving a lecture in London, I could go in for the lecture and come back for the evening if I was in Cambridge, or vice versa. If I was in London, I could go to Cambridge, I could go to Oxford, come back for the evening. And at that meeting, at that lecture, there might be people in attendance from 24 universities. And of these 24 universities, perhaps, of them, maybe 7 or 8 of them would have been in the top 20 in the world. In other words, that sort of London conurbation of a great deal of universities, but where people can get together very easily. The result is, in that room, you had a tremendous amount of brain power coming together. So somebody would give a presentation, and the feedback they would get would be of a caliber that meant that the paper that would come out of it would be something that would go into a leading journal, or possibly be Nobel-worthy work. At a university in Canada, if you give a seminar in your field, you're really only going to be able to get maybe a handful of colleagues from your university. You might, if you're in Ottawa, you might get someone from Montreal or Kingston coming up, but you simply can't get the same mass of mind power together. So what in Canada tends to happen is they rely on these annual conferences where people come from all over the country for a few days. But nothing compares to that ability to do it, if need be, several times a week. That kind of ability to create an economy of agglomeration leads to tremendous productivity impacts. And in terms of the way you would measure that in higher education would be, okay, well, let's look at the research output. What are the citation counts? What are the number of patents which get registered? And if you look at all those, all the various tables league tables you could sort of put together for how the world's universities do, you would say that I would say at any rate, I would say the Canadian higher education system's not very efficient. Okay, we spend a lot of money in Canada, but we don't get the same bang for the buck. I mean,
because they don't interact with each other often enough?
That's a big part of it, is that people are left to work in isolation. And so they develop ideas. And so you have very good minds, but they're working in this sort of, I call it splendid isolation. They're not actually isolated. But there's no question.
Well, even, UTM, University of Toronto, Mississauga, it's a good hour to get from UTM to U of T downtown. And, maybe 45 minutes to get from the Scarborough Conference campus to downtown. We got to take a break for some messages. But we've been talking with John Rapley about cities, about densification, about transit, about productivity, about prosperity. Interesting conversation tonight. Back in 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight about Canadian prosperity, and we've got into some city economics and dynamics as well with John Rapley, who is a columnist, an economist, a deep thinker. He's in the Globe and Mail about every Saturday. He is in Johannesburg in Canada, used to be in Cambridge, England as well. He's an academic, and he is a really, as I said, a smart thinker, a deep thinker, and someone who writes incredibly well. I follow him every weekend, and I love the articles and columns, and I want to reach out to you every weekend. And I know I can't bother you that often, but it's a real pleasure to have you back on the show, sir. So one of the big things that you've talked about is lack of innovation, lack of productivity, and thereby the lack of prosperity, such that Canada, right now people think has got 71% of the productivity in the United States and something like that of the median average income in the United States. And people are saying that we haven't had growth in real median incomes in something like 15 years. What's caused that situation, other than complacency, which you talked about already?
I think we have to put it in context, Brian. I mean, all developed economies are going through a period of sluggishness, which may be chronic, which may be permanent. I mean, it's been going on for a long time. It's been going on since the financial crisis. The trend growth lines of all Western economies, with the exception of the US, I'll come to the US in a minute, has gone way down. And in some cases, Canada doesn't stand alone in that it's actually going backwards in per capita, in real per capita terms. Incomes are declining, which means that Canadians are getting poor by the year. But that's not exceptional. There are other developed countries like Britain, which are doing as badly or even worse in some cases, or Italy and Germany. What is behind that are a number of features that, I wrote about this in my most recent book with my colleague Peter Heather called Why Empires Fall. There is a sort of life cycle to an economic system, and it seems to have peaked. What that means is that we simply cannot go back to the growth rates of the post-war period, when the economy was growing 4 or 5 or 6% a year, and there was a big wave of migration from war-ravaged Europe, and people came in like my parents who, it was a time of tremendous opportunity. Well, it's not like that now, and it's not going to be like that. But that doesn't mean we can't improve upon our performance. I mean, there are things we can do, and I think to some extent the Americans are showing A, how to do it, but B, the challenges involved, which is governments need to spend a lot of money. And it wasn't the Americans who really started this with the the return of industrial policy really under the Biden administration. The Trump administration started a bit of it, but it got really turbocharged under Biden. But they were responding to the Chinese, who've been doing it for a generation. And the Chinese, the pace of change and technological development is simply astonishing. Corporate executives who were returning to China after 2 years during the COVID lockdowns couldn't believe what they had seen change in that short time they're away. These are Western corporate executives with branches there who are going and saying, we've just been completely overtaken in that short period of time. A lot of the new technology, a lot of the, quite honestly, the research output, the output of Chinese universities, leaping far ahead of us. And as I say, I think that's where the complacency is dangerous. We have been able to ride that first wave of Chinese industrialization that served Canada pretty well right into the early years of this century, because, in fact, even past the financial crisis. One of the reasons why Canada perhaps didn't suffer as badly in 2008 was, first off, we didn't have our housing bubble then. We waited a decade and then we did it in, in real style. Secondly, though, we were able to ride, there was another sort of wave, a commodity super cycle as a result of Chinese huge stimulus that occurred after 2008. So there was demand for the exports, the primary exports coming out of Canada. And I think that sort of bred, I think we missed a big opportunity in that whole period. Canada wasn't unusual in missing that opportunity, but this was the time governments should have been looking to the future and getting ambitious. Instead, they were going the opposite direction. They were trying to balance budgets, cut taxes, all with this idea that we're going to kind of revive the private economy. But instead, what it tended to do is it tended to steer money amid this emerging sluggishness towards wealth protection rather than wealth expansion. And so that was very much, drawing money into the property sector, because you can sort of protect the value of your investment that way. But as I say, the property sector produces nothing. It's a complete, it's been a massive misallocation of capital in Canada, and the country's paying a high price for that, and will continue paying a high price.
Massive misallocation of capital.
Right. Money that, if you look at business investment in Canada, had been declining throughout the last, ever since the financial crisis of 2008, but property investment has been booming. So money that should have been steered into new industrial development, that's when government should have started to get ambitious and say, okay, what's the future? We're not going to be able to live off commodity exports forever. What's the future? Where is it going to lie? What can we do? The kind of things that, as I say, China was doing, we weren't doing. Instead, we're
building like half the houses we need to be building, and we've got this lack of supply. So if anything, more money needs to go into the housing sector.
No, it's not. No, this is the thing. It's not the question when I say more, because the assumption is there's a fixed, price per unit. What's happening, Brian, is precisely, and this is a fundamental problem that Canada has in its housing crisis, is that those who own the real estate want to block further housing construction for that they want money to pour into the sector because that inflates the value of their properties. But what they don't want is a hugely ambitious program of house building. If you want to see what a hugely ambitious program of house building looks like, you look at Tokyo. Tokyo over the last 20 years has built a huge amount of housing. And the result of that is that the cost of living in Tokyo has gone down. Now, that's not in your interest. If you're living off the dividend stream of a rental property, to have the value of your house go down, but it's very good for the economy, because what it does is it reduces the cost of production. First of all, it's not just homeowners, but it's also business people, someone setting up a business who has to pay rent on that property. If their rent is actually going down,
how'd Tokyo do it?
How did Tokyo do it? With an ambitious program, as I say, of government-led housing construction. And this is what, but again, there's such a reluctance to do this. The trend in Canada, if I just look at commentary on the budget, one of the curious lines I found recurring in criticism of the federal budget, I have my own criticisms of the federal budget, but one of the curious ones is people say, oh, this is another tax and spend government. Well, calling a government tax and spend a tax and spend government, Brian, is a bit like saying a hockey player is a shoot and score hockey player. That's what a government exists to do. Its job is to provide public services, and in order to cover the cost of those, it taxes, but it generates the tax revenue from, if it's doing a good job of providing public services by improving the efficiency of the economy and increasing the tax output, tax collection. So but the very idea is somehow this kind of illusory notion, well, in an ideal world, we'd have no government and no taxes. And I don't know where that ideal world is. What I can say, Brian, is, you know, in the course of my, you know, career in development economics, you know, I've been to countries which have very limited government. I can tell you, you wouldn't want to live in those places, and you certainly want to run a business in those places because, you know, if someone comes and robs your business, you can't call the police because there is no police force. So I think the debate we have around economic policy in Canada is itself, it sort of seems like an artifact of another era, a different era. And even, excuse me, listening to some of the criticisms that come from the opposition in Canada, which is, well, you know, we need to just, government needs to get out of the way. And I'm kind of thinking, you know, there are not many countries in the world right now where government is now the governments are generally going the opposite direction. The reason they're going the opposite direction is because of the China challenge and now the US challenge. We're going to, our industrial sector, which is already, as I say, relatively underdeveloped for a country of this level of per capita income, is going to get hurt even more if we don't respond to this challenge. Does that mean government should just willy-nilly be throwing money at the development of new industrial sectors? You know, it gets a lot of criticism for putting money into battery plants or EV, you know, electric vehicle production. Maybe, maybe not. But I think even the way we assess industrial policy is done all wrong. There's a tendency to say, well, okay, this much money was spent, you know, and yet the company went out of business. But the successful industrial policy doesn't develop new businesses, it develops new sectors. And part of that experience is, you know, the countries that have done it successfully, governments would nurture firms which then went to the wall, but in the process produced, let's say, you know, the engineering know-how that enabled those engineers to go work for new firms that became successful. So you will have successes and failures. The question is, overall, are you creating a new sector, a new subsector?
So you think this industrial policy that Biden's been criticized for in the United States, the you know, the infrastructure spending, the Inflation Reduction Act, et cetera, that has created a deficit to GDP that is actually higher than Canada. You think that's good policy?
Well, there's very much a debate going on as to whether or not it's sustainable. And I'm certainly a participant in that debate, and I have my doubts, Brian. What I will say is that the research we have, and, you know, it's only been in effect for a few years, but we now have a good body of research, which is bolstered by research done from other countries which have longer experiences with industrial policy. But the research we have suggests that it is actually leading to improvements in labor productivity. It is leading to an expansion in private investment. What it is certainly doing is crowding in a massive amount of investment. I mean, the American stock market's on fire because investors from around the world are coming in to take advantage of the opportunities that are being created, both in government programs and then from the spin-off effects, you know, the new companies coming into existence, which need to hire whatever workers or need to get inputs. And therefore, you know, stock markets until recently in most other Western countries have been in a funk, but the US market has been taken off because of this crowding in effect. So we can see that done properly, it can create huge benefits. Is it sustainable? No. Is the solution to cut back on this industrial program? With the United States, are there other options it could look at? It could, for example, and it may well, roll back the Trump tax cuts, which most of the research suggests did not lead to the kind of productivity benefits it was touted to have.
You mean trickle-down economics doesn't really exist?
Well, it exists in the minds of many people, but we haven't ever really found a substantial part of evidence. It works in certain circumstances, but usually the way it works well, Brian, is after a period of this kind of successful government-driven industrial expansion, where you now have a private sector ready to operate. And if you can then the government can step back at that stage and cut taxes to release them for that kind of investment, then it's going to work. If you cut it the way it's been done in Canada over the last 15 years, for example, where you don't have this emerging sector sufficient to absorb that capital, then you get the kind of misallocation. What I think Canada should have been doing over the last 15 years wasn't to cut taxes, but to actually be spending a lot more ambitiously, I think, on infrastructure for starters and housing. You know, and I think that this is an area where Canada, quite honestly, is way behind. You come back to the example we started with of taking a train journey in Canada. I mean, it's very charming experience taking via rail, because you do feel like you're going back to, you know, the old world. You know, it's kind of very, you know, there's an attendant at every
Like the
door.
Orient Express.
Almost. And it's certainly, you know, when my family visit from abroad and they take a train in Canada and they say, oh, it's just like in the old days, you know, and but if you're thinking of efficiency, you know, it is. I was quite astonished. I looked once, I was curious to see how fast the trains were in Canada in the late 19th century, and the times have barely not changed. They were more or less moving as fast then as they are now. Of course, they can move faster, but the problem is that because they operate on these rails that are owned by the freight companies, they can only move at the speed of the freight trains. They need dedicated track. But that would be the kind of investment, I think. And the government is looking into it with this idea of
high-speed rail.
Yeah.
City rapid transit like subways. What would be your priorities for infrastructure spending?
I would say high-speed rail. I would say I think public transit in all Canadian cities. I think you need to have housing should be in there. And I think you need to have densification within cities. You need to have high-speed internet. You know, that's going to be vital. And I think the country should be thinking very seriously about the technologies of the future and how they can try and get the country into the industries. I mean, leaving it to the private sector, what's going to happen is what usually happens in Canada. The really bright people with great ideas end up going south of the border, because that's
they take their companies and their ideas to Silicon Valley or New York.
And yeah, and a lot of it has to do with what I just mentioned a little while ago, the economies of agglomeration. If Canada could actually nurture the clusters, that would encourage these people in the ecosystems for them to stay at home and do this. You know, it could be a different experience, but it's not doing that right now.
Well, maybe I could ask you a little bit more about that after we take a break, because I do think that we've got a potential that we're squandering, and I'd like to ask you a little bit about that and what we would actually do. We're going to take a break for 2 minutes and be back with John Rapley, and we're going to talk a little bit about the airport corporate zone, if we could, Toronto, Kitchener-Waterloo, super clusters, agglomeration, just after a break. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm chatting tonight with John Rapley. He is a academic. He's an economist. He's a commentator. He's a deep thinker. He writes in the Globe and Mail every Saturday. He's in Johannesburg. He's in London. He's in Toronto. You're everywhere, and you're having a big impact. I want to ask you about this comment you just made about agglomeration and super clusters. And it's sort of an academic term, but I think it's really important. There's the airport corporate zone, which I mentioned, and there was this really interesting study that was done taking a look at patents in Canada. And it showed that, you know, across North America, most patents sort of concentrated around universities. And so university was the nucleus or the incubator or the start of the patents. But in Mississauga and Toronto, it was Pearson Airport in the 401 that was the sort of the center of a whole bunch of patents. And some people think, and I'd be interested in your point of view, that patents created innovation, created high-paid jobs, created economic activity, et cetera. So patents were an interesting thing that you could look at to see, you know, what was starting things. And there was a concentration of patents downtown Toronto near the University of Toronto and the hospitals on University Avenue. But there was another big concentration that sort of came out west of Pearson Airport. And the hypothesis is that it was because of a lot of the pharmaceutical companies and high-tech companies that may not have been Canadian, but were Canadian subs of foreign companies that had come and set up plants or laboratories or factories or whatever, and they located there because they wanted proximity to the airport, and so therefore we had the second largest employment zone in all of Canada sort of develop. There's been a fair amount of government funding of Kitchener-Waterloo, of downtown Toronto, of a fisheries thing in Atlantic Canada, and some natural resource stuff in in Alberta and some biotech stuff in Vancouver, but no focus and attention on this airport corporate zone. As we talked about before, there's no rapid transit that comes to the airport corporate zone. It's split up amongst three different cities, Toronto, Rexdale, Brampton, and Mississauga. So there's not sort of a politician that sort of pays attention to it. There's no Board of Trade. There's no BIA. It just doesn't, it's sort of not incubated. It's not, and there was a Austrian economist that I think at one point in time said entrepreneurship was some synchronicity in the air, that there's something special about the economics of agglomeration. So if this is such a great center of innovation and economic power, what would you do to try to grow it, to make it an engine?
I'd have to look at, this specific one. That's very interesting what you say, Brian, and I'm intrigued to find out more. In principle, what I would say is, as I mentioned, the kind of facilitating investments government can make to facilitate economies of agglomeration. I think that I would start with infrastructure, but I would also look at investment in research and development. Canada punches below its weight in terms of patents, for example. I mean, a country like South Korea does much better. And that's fairly recent. I mean, there's just no excuse for Canada not to be producing more patents than it does. I think there's lots of Canadian patent holders, but as I say, I think they end up going elsewhere to register their patents, because the environment isn't always friendly to business. I remember talking with somebody who said to me, who was a young business person and was frustrated at the challenges of trying to build a business, who said, in hindsight, I should have just taken my capital and bought a house, because I would have, the value of my investment would have gone up quicker than I could make this business grow, because there are so many obstacles to doing business. And the obstacles aren't necessarily, when we talk about obstacles to doing business in Canada, we often focus on government regulation at the federal level. A lot of it is municipal regulations. A lot of it is the cost of real estate. I mean, simple cost of setting up a business, as I say, of renting premises is so high. I think, so I think there probably should be more money in research development. And I think there should be, to use an example I wrote about recently in the Globe and Mail, in the sort of renewable technology sector, there are firms in Canada. There is an ecosystem of firms. I think, in Toronto area and also in Alberta, interestingly. And I think, there would be a case for throwing money at them, to be honest, sort of making them, subsidizing their output, making them take off. And the idea being that that would encourage graduates in that field to keep, rather than leaving Canada to go work for these companies where they could apply their skills and possibly increase our patent output. I don't know enough about the university sector. I've been, in the last 10 years or so, I've been a visiting professor at a couple of Canadian universities. And so I sort of develop a sense of how things are here. My sense is, in the same way I say Canada's punching below its weight in terms of patents, in terms of research and development, is I would think Canadian universities are probably also punching below their weight, partly for the reasons I said. I think there aren't the economies of agglomeration, and government could do a lot to help that. But there may be other obstacles, which mean that while you have good people, very, very, world-class researchers at Canadian universities, I think a lot of them probably would say they feel like they're working on their own. They're not part of an ecosystem. A lot of them end up, in their sabbaticals. How do they spend their sabbatical years? Well, I can tell you, when I was, teaching in Cambridge, every year you'd meet a new raft of Canadian academics who were coming over there for the sabbatical. What you didn't have is a lot of Cambridge and Oxford academics coming to Canadian universities. And that, if we really were, I think, in Canada, punching at our weight, as I put it, you would be attracting a lot of those people. There would be more cross-fertilization. So I think there's various things we need to step up our game a bit. But as I say, I think we've had it a bit easy for so long that we're not really in a competitive race, but the world is becoming very competitive. We're losing, if you look, again, you go back to patenting, and you take a country like India, which has a per capita income a fraction of Canada's, but the speed at which it's developing that particular you know, in sort of information technology and some of the innovations that are happening there in pharmaceuticals, some of the innovations taking place in India. And they don't have anywhere near the sort of the base that we have. I mean, there's just no excuse for falling behind countries like that, but we are falling behind here in Canada.
You've mentioned ecosystem several times. How do you create a well-functioning ecosystem?
I think ecosystems emerge, Brian. I think I don't think any government could create, well, maybe it could. It would have to be a very, 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 you know, capable government. You know, possibly the Chinese have created ecosystems. I think what governments can do is facilitate the emergence of ecosystems with the kind of, you know, coming back to this tax and spend. Well, what are the things that government should be spending on? They should be spending on the things that, well, a number of things, but when it comes to the economy, that facilitate economic production, that facilitate, that improve efficiency, and you know, lower the barriers to entry for new firms. And well, what would those things be? Well, again, come back to if you took new development charges off the shoulders, you know, or so infrastructure charges off of the cost of building any kind of industry, any kind of factory, any kind of house, and you sort of said, well, that should be, you know, in the public domain. I mean, to use an illustration of just how backward things can be in Canada, I notice here, I'm in Ottawa right now for the summer, and the city has a standard development charge essentially across the city. So if you're building a house downtown, if you want to build, let's say, you know, you've got zoning permission to build a fourplex downtown, so you don't need any new infrastructure. You could therefore build those properties and make them more affordable. But what they're doing is they're cross-subsidizing. They're basically saying, well, you know, every unit will have to pay this infrastructure charge, and we'll use that to reduce the cost of building far out in the suburbs so we can keep planning these roads. The infrastructure deadweight costs in Canada are very huge, just because of the way we have these very, very sprawling cities. As I point out to people, you know, Tokyo occupies less landmass than Ottawa, even though it has 20 times the population. And
Hold it. Tokyo has the same landmass as Ottawa and
less,
20 times times the population.
Yeah, and it's not because you feel necessarily claustrophobic. I mean, it is. I mean, it's true that, you know, housing, and if you've ever been to Japan, you know, the apartments are very small, but they're also highly efficient, and there's an awful lot of public space, and you can walk. You know, you can walk everywhere. Everything is accessible. You don't need cars, and so therefore you don't, nothing like you need them now. So you don't have to have these very wide roads. I mean, you have these suburban developments with 4-lane roads in them, which is just mind-blowing, which are empty most of the day. They have those 4 lanes because twice a day for about a half hour, you know, there's a lot of traffic and people don't want to be in a single file of traffic. But that's a huge, you know, if you think of that, the cost of building that road, and the same goes for parking lots, all the stores that have to have these very large parking lots, and parking lots are actually hugely expensive to build. It would be cheaper to do without the parking lot and build the train line. Actually, you know, somebody's actually worked this out. But to come back to this illustration from Ottawa of the way housing charges are redistributed, what you're doing essentially is you're saying, okay, we figured out an efficient way to build a house in town that can bring down the cost of accommodation, and an inefficient way of doing it by going further and further out into the green belt. Why don't we tax the most efficient sector to subsidize the inefficient sector? So it should be the opposite. You should be taxing the inefficient. You should be looking, for example, when you look at tax and spend, you should be saying the industries we want to tax most heavily aren't the ones. We shouldn't say, for example, as they, you know, one hears sometimes, well, you shouldn't tax resource extraction because it's our most productive sector. Well, I would say you should tax it because it's also the one that has the least future. In 20 years' time, you're not going to be able to ride that wave as you are now. What you should be doing is taxing it now in order to redistribute. This is what Norway has done, for example. Norway has taxed its oil and natural gas exports in order to build its renewable energy industry, in order to build the infrastructure that's going to enable it when the oil runs out, or when the oil simply isn't worth as much as it is now. to have an industrial sector ready to take up that slack. And we're not thinking that way in Canada anywhere near enough. Every single effort that any government makes at anything resembling an industrial policy is immediately sort of slapped down by critics as being government overstepping the bounds and doing what the private sector does, except the private sector isn't doing it. Private sector is just to a very substantial degree buying real estate and riding the wave, as that young business person I was speaking to complained. That's the way you get rich in Canada lately, at any rate.
It's a shame that we've built the system where we've priced our kids out of housing and created a situation where way too much capital has gone into the real estate business and not into productive means. And we've got one of the lowest business investments in capital improvements and investments in R&D in the OECD. We're going to take a break and come back with John Rapley for some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight, John Rapley, columnist in the Globe and Mail, very smart business professor, academic thinker, very involved in development economics around the world. And he studied different countries and different cities and what makes them successful. John, I got to ask you, you commented about complacency earlier. I ended up having a really interesting conversation a couple of days ago with Bob McCowan, who is a hockey commentator. And he said that the biggest disease in hockey teams was complacency and mediocrity. He said the Leafs have lost 7 game 7s in a row, and they haven't made it past the first round, and they're complacent, and the hockey fans are a problem because they're okay with it. And what you need to do is demand excellence, and we should fire the coach and trade away 4 players and go through a complete rebuild. The next day, they actually fired the coach. I think he wanted to go farther. It was interesting that he used sort of the same words for hockey that you're using for governments. Tell me, what's your concern about complacency and what do we do about it?
Well, it's interesting, Brian. I mean, I have to confess, I'm not a hockey fan, but the Leafs are legendary, not just in the hockey world, but in the world generally, that you have this very successful financially franchise, which has not had to perform at all in order to sort of merit that those returns. And it's really quite astonishing. It is a test case in how, I guess you could say, a fan base abets mediocrity. I don't know why. I used to, my friends who are hockey fans will say, well, unlike fans in other cities, Toronto fans aren't particularly sophisticated. They don't, they don't know what really good hockey is, so they've stopped demanding it. I simply don't know. I think there may be something in that analogy, though, that in a sense, we have had it easy. As I've always said, I mean, the 20th century in particular, I'm not saying that Canadians simply just sat back and lived off the exports of primary resources. I mean, they were doing other things and doing good things. I think, however, there may have come a time when they just stopped doing the other good things. I mean, that the kind of innovations, the kind of engineering, maybe it had to do with, when the government got less ambitious and got out of producing, new, when defense spending started getting cut, because of course defense spending is a big source of R&D in the United States. And maybe that was a mistake. Maybe it was, the country should have done as European countries did and went heavily into continuing to develop, building, new railways. Had they developed high-speed rail much earlier, like the Japanese did, that would have created a whole ecosystem of industries there. I think probably there was this sort of lack of ambition on the part of governments for whatever reasons, which perhaps reflected a lack of ambition on the part of Canadians who became satisfied with mediocrity, because mediocrity didn't, in fact, rather like the Leafs, affect the prosperity. But I think the difference, what I'm saying, is that the world is changing. The demand, the resource input into the output globally over time is diminishing. It's going to continue diminishing as the rest of the world develops. And trying to live off, not making that adaptation. I mean, I recently drew an analogy in another Globe and Mail column to what, Argentina failing to make that transition in the 20th century from being essentially a primary exporter like Canada into any kind of manufacturing. Canada made some transition, I think insufficient, but into manufacturing. But now what really needs to be looking into, moving into knowledge intensive industries, and it's very far behind. And I think that that kind of complacency will hurt. I mean, it might not hurt the Leafs, but I think it will hurt Canada.
Complacency, mediocrity. I think it does hurt. I think that we do need to think bigger. We need to be more aggressive. We did great things with the Olympics with the own the podium attitude and funding the potential winners. And I think we need a Team Canada own the podium kind of attitude to economic development and entrepreneurship and super clusters. And I think the super cluster program that the federal government has put in place has worked. And there are numerous different companies that have grown out of that. I hear about them on a fairly regular basis, but I do think we need more, and we need more attention to it. And I do think that we need to attack mediocrity and complacency and go through a rebuild. And, you're in Ottawa. And so I'll tell you that in 2017, Eugene Melnyk, the owner of the Ottawa Senators, had a big summit meeting with a whole bunch of people because we had made it to Game 6 of the third round, but we weren't going to make it farther. And he wanted a Stanley Cup. And he went through a rebuild. And a lot of people questioned that, but it was the right decision, I think. And here the Leafs are in the first round, not going ahead. So I do think that there is an analogy, whether it be in hockey or in funding Olympic athletes or in funding superclusters. Big ideas, ambition, own the podium, not being satisfied with mediocrity and complacency. I think it works. It's true. I think we need to move forward. Anyway, John, I really appreciate you joining us. John Rapley.
Been a pleasure, Brian.
Thank you very much. That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Ottawa or Johannesburg at www.saga960am.ca. My podcasts and videos are on my website, briancrombie.com. Good night, everybody. Thank you, sir.